but it was DG Magwood at his position as the Director of Nuclear Energy that hired me into the nuclear energy space. And okay, that's not worth clapping for, but thank you. He's got bad judgment, as does Rita Barronwall and Mike Goff, who are also bosses, previous and current. But it is DG Magwood who introduced me into this space, and more importantly, by example, made me a champion, gave me a voice, and dared me to use it. He is a man among men. And so when I introduce him, it matters not what positions he's had. What matters is that he is a leader in a sector that is hungry, thirsty, and desperate for more leadership. I am so grateful that he is always a supporter, that he is always an amazing example, and that he is remaining my mentor and friend. I would ask that you welcome Director General Bill Magwood to the stage.
Turned it off. Good morning. Well, I'm almost afraid to say anything after that introduction. Well, let me begin by thanking Alicia. Alicia, thank you for many things, but Alicia and the team for working so hard to put this event together. It's a fantastic event and a very important event for a variety of reasons. Let me also thank our Kenyan host, particularly NEA, for welcoming us so completely. It's been a real honor to be here, and like our Ghanaian friend, this is my first time in Kenya. I was supposed to come a few years ago, but there's this little thing about the pandemic that got in the way. But finally here, and very pleased to be here. And I can tell you that it will certainly not be my last time visiting with you. The principal reason I'm here is because the world has changed in a very, very substantial way. And I'm not sure how many people realize it, but we've reached a juncture in the history of this world. And the future is going to be dictated by a couple of key factors. The success or failure of economies, societies, and countries, in my view, will depend on two things. It'll depend on people who are trained, people who are motivated, people who are enabled. And it's also going to depend on electricity, and I use that term very specifically. People and electricity. Those are going to be the two factors that will determine the success of economies around the world. If you don't have trained people, you will not be successful. If you don't have electricity, reliable, cost-effective electricity, your economies will not prosper. In that context, we are also in the middle of a fight against climate change. And countries around the world are struggling to find a path to maintain their access to reliable electricity while dealing with the climate crisis. And I suspect there are probably policymakers and leaders around the world, perhaps in past decades, that actually thought this was going to be relatively straightforward. Build some wind turbines, put up some solar panels, be a bit more efficient, drive an electric vehicle, problem solved. Not so much. The countries I work with, we're on a path that focus principally on just having more renewables and energy efficiency to deal with the climate crisis. But as they were asked to be more specific about how their plans are going to reach net zero by 2050, they found that the numbers weren't converging. They weren't reaching net zero. In fact, in many cases, emissions were going up. That's why in COP28, you saw 25 leaders come together and declare a need to triple nuclear capacity. This wasn't a surprise to us. This was actually quite expected because we'd been working with countries that had come to this conclusion and were changing policies. In fact, in some cases, completely reversing policies to build new nuclear. And this is taking place around the world. Nuclear is in the rise. Both small modular reactors and existing technologies, I believe, will be absolutely essential to meeting the climate crisis and perhaps more importantly, providing energy security for countries around the world. Now at this point, I want to talk honestly with you. But before I begin, maybe I should just find out, are there any Africans in the room? Would you raise your hands, please? Are there any Africans? I don't see too many hands. No? Okay, there's a few out there. The rest of you just get out, okay? I'm not talking to you at this point. We've heard the numbers, about 640 million people without access to reliable electricity in Africa. First time I heard that number was last year. And for me personally, I found it to be a devastating thing to hear. To think that this continent, at this stage in history, in the 21st century, has that many people that can't turn a light on so their children can study. They can't pump water. It seems tragic. Boy, what's even more tragic is when you recall another number I heard last year, which is by 2050, that 1/4 of all humanity will be African. If these trends continue as we are today, it's a global catastrophe. It affects not just people in Africa, it affects everyone around the world. We absolutely can't sit by and allow this to happen. So leaders, ministers who are here today, who have talked about the need for transitioning their economies and their energy infrastructures, I thank you and I congratulate you, because your leadership will be important to make sure that that darker future is not realized. Now, I stand here as not an African, not an expert in Africa. In fact, this is only my 4th time on the continent. So as I talk to you as an American living in Paris, who runs an international organization, who is learning, and who hopes to learn a great deal more from you as we go forward. But I will tell you that as I have talked to my colleagues in countries around the world, and perhaps even more interesting, as I talk to people in Africa who are not in this business, but who are just normal people, the perceptions, when I say nuclear in Africa, they say, why? Why would you do that? And what are the perceptions? You know the perceptions, but I'm going to tell you out loud because I think it's important to put it on the table. Africa's too poor to have nuclear energy. And of course, Africa is poor. There are many people who live in poverty in Africa. We see it every day. Africa is too politically unstable. Well, okay. Yes, there are parts of Africa where we do have political instability. One thing that I heard, and I heard this just at a dinner just last week from a lady in Africa, an African lady, a Kenyan lady. Africa's too corrupt to have nuclear energy. These are your perceptions. She told me a story about how trash is taken from her area and dumped illegally on the ground someplace. Corruption, people are not responsible. How can we run nuclear power plants? That is the perception both outside Africa and inside Africa. Those are realities, those perceptions that you have to deal with. So that's why people say, why Africa? Why is this important? Why would you do this? To me, you always have to take the step back. I've always been interested in history, so I do a lot of reading. And history shows you truth. You think when the United States started doing nuclear power that everybody that ran nuclear power plants were experts? They were not. Most of the people that ran the first nuclear power plants in the US were people who had run coal plants the year before. They were learning with everybody else. They were not experts. They didn't have refinements. The regulator was nowhere near as proficient as it is today. Think about Korea. I know that Kenya works very closely with Korea. The year I was born, Korea was one of the poorest, lowest capacity countries on the planet. They looked completely hopeless. But they made a determination to invest in their people. And over the course of generations, not that many, because it's only been about 50, 60 years, they are now one of the leading economies in the world and a leading supplier of nuclear technology. They didn't get there the easy way, they worked for it. So when people tell you that Africa is in these terrible positions, some of that may be true today, but it's not necessarily true for the future. A lot of these perceptions aren't even completely accurate. Yes, there are countries in Africa that have political issues. We all know that. But many of the countries here today, perhaps all the countries here today, are very, very stable democracies that have had peaceful handover of government. Even my own home country, we've had our issues. Everybody has issues. In France today, they can't even form a government. So these things are perceptions. In Africa today, there are very, very proficient experts. We see them all the time. I have visited Kenya. I've visited facilities. They are as well run as any facilities in the United States. And there are people in this room who are as expert and motivated and proficient in their jobs as anyone in an OECD country. Like all of you, where's Winnie? Winnie, where are you? Winnie, stand up. I would bring Winnie to any... Winnie would be a success in any organization in the US, in France, in Japan, anywhere else. And there are a lot of Winnies in Africa. So why not Africa? You have people. Is Africa poor? Of course Africa is poor. You know, the GDP of Kenya is about the same as Bulgaria. And when